To show you how you could run into problems when working with on-push and services, I prepared a service for you, which you find attached. This messages service.ts file is attached, and you should store it next to the messages component. In there, I'm at the moment managing a signal, which manages my array of strings, and I have this simple add message method to change that array, and then I provide access to all my messages in a read-only mode. Now in the new message component, we can inject that service to trigger its add message method whenever a new message is submitted. So instead of having an output here, I'll add my messages service here by injecting it with the inject function in my case here. Messages service like this. And of course, for that, both the service as well as the inject function must be imported, whereas the output function is not needed anymore. And in the new message component class, in onSubmit, I therefore won't emit my entered text as an event anymore. Instead, I'll use this messages service to call the add message method and pass my entered text to it like this. Now in the messages component, I no longer want to listen to this add event because it's not going to get emitted anymore. And I no longer want to manage my messages in there. So I'll delete this messages signal from the messages component and get rid of the onAddMessage method here, because we're now managing those messages in that service. Therefore, we can also remove the signal import. In the messages component HTML file, we should therefore remove this messages property binding. And in the app messages list component, I want to remove this input therefore, and remove the import of the input function. Because here we're now also going to use that service to get hold of those messages. With help of the inject function again, in my case here, like this, importing the service, importing inject, and then I'll add a public property here, messages, which is this messages service, all messages. And that gives me that read-only signal. I'm not reading it here, I don't have parentheses here, I'm just pointing at it so that it's the signal that's stored in this property. Because that then allows me to go to the template here and read that as a signal as I did before, but now it's the messages from the service. It's also important that messages list is an onPush component and new message is an onPush component. And the messages component also is onPush here in this case, though that actually doesn't matter. But with this setup, we would now have a problem if we would not use signals, as you'll see in a second. Here, however, I am using signals, and therefore here everything will work as before. If we reload and we wait for these counters to expire so that we have a clear log, if I enter something here, testing, if I save this, you see the message shows up here and we get the same kind of logs as before. So that all works just as before without any changes. But now let's migrate from this signal-based service to a non-signal-based service with those onPush components, because that will give us a problem. So let's migrate to a non-signal-based service. And for that, I'll start by converting my messages property in the messages service to a normal property, which is not a signal, which will hold an array of strings, which initially is empty. And therefore I can remove that signal function import. All messages then should be a getter, let's say, where I simply return a copy of this messages. And in add message, I will overwrite this messages by also creating such a copy, and by then adding the new message as a last element into this new array. In the new message component, we now continue calling add message as before. And it does not matter whether entered text is a signal or not. But we could also change that from a signal to a regular property, a regular string. And then down here, not read it. And reset it by simply setting it to a regular string again. In the template, we don't need to change anything because the template binding syntax is always the same. And in the messages list component here, I now don't want to get my messages like this. Instead, I'll add a getter here, messages, where I'll return this messages service all messages, which will therefore give me that array of strings in the end. In the template, we therefore no longer read that value because it no longer is a signal. Instead, we just use it like this. If you do that and you save everything and you reload and you again wait for those timers to expire so that the log here isn't messed up, I can enter values and that works as before. But if I save this, you'll see something interesting. The message is not showing up down here. And indeed here, if you take a look at the log messages, you won't see a log message for this messages list component. It's not part of that log because change detection wasn't triggered for that component. And why was that the case? Well, because the messages list component is an onPush component, and therefore, as I explained, change detection for this component runs if an input changes, and here I have no inputs. If we trigger it manually, and that's not happening here. If we have an event in this component or a child component, and that's also not the case here. Or if a signal changes here in this component, and that's also not the case. And that's why this component is never checked for changes and why the new message doesn't show up here. So what can you do in situations like this? That's exactly what we'll take a look at in the next lectures.